For 6 long months, Silas Redmond had kept a fragile peace alive not with words or force, but through the quiet strength of his presence and the neutrality of his land. His ranch, a modest stretch of dust and prairie in the Texas hill country, had become an unspoken boundary line. Comanche warriors respected it. Settlers left it alone. No guns were drawn. No blood spilled not there. Silas had earned that balance through sweat, scars, and a firm handshake offered to both sides. But that peace cracked the moment a young Comanche collapsed in his yard, bleeding through a torn shirt and barely able to speak. The boy's name was Hawk Runner, and his eyes held both pain and warning. He rasped that soldiers were after him, cavalry, and that Silas needed to send him away before it was too late. Yet the boy's legs gave out before he could crawl off the porch. Silas knelt beside him, took one look at the arrow wound in his side, and knew 2 things: this kid would die without help, and saving him could cost Silas everything he'd built. Still, he carried Hawk Runner inside, wrapped him in blankets, and tended the wound as best he could with rough hands trained by necessity, not schooling. By sundown, soldiers arrived. Lieutenant Warren Kane dismounted with the arrogance of someone used to getting what he wanted. He claimed the boy had stolen supplies meant for reservation families and killed 2 men in the process. Kane demanded to search the property. Silas, never one for wasted words, refused outright. Something in Kane's eyes told him this wasn't about justice, it was a cover story. A Comanche-style pouch in Kane's saddlebag looked too new, too clean, and something didn't sit right. The smell of a setup hung thick in the air. When soldiers discovered bloody cloth behind the barn, Kane smiled like a man who thought the game was already won. Silas didn't flinch. He stood his ground, arms crossed, rifle within reach, heart beating steady. He'd faced worse odds. But that night, things changed. From the hills came the echo of drums, deep, steady, ominous. War drums. By morning, riders crested the ridge. Not just a few, hundreds. Warriors from 5 different Comanche bands encircled the ranch. At their head rode a tall man with a braided mane streaked with gray and eyes like Flint Stormwatcher, Hawk Runner's father. The man's presence alone carried the weight of judgment. He dismounted without a word and stared long at Silas before turning to Kane. The air crackled with tension. Kane, sensing the tide shifting, grew bolder, accusing Silas again, louder now, trying to win the crowd with noise. But truth has a quieter voice, and when Hawk Runner stepped out from the bunkhouse, wrapped in a blanket but standing tall despite his injuries, everything stopped. The boy raised his hand and spoke. He told them the truth: the supply wagon was a ruse. Soldiers weren't delivering food, they were escorting a government surveyor marking tribal burial lands for mining claims. When Hawk Runner tried to stop them peacefully, they shot him. He escaped only by leaping into a river and riding all night through mesquite and thorn. Silas had saved him. Not harbored a fugitive, saved a truth-teller. Stormwatcher listened in silence, then invoked tribal law, trial by combat. If Kane's accusations stood, he'd have to prove them in single combat. Kane sneered, but had no choice. The fight was short and brutal. Kane lost, badly. His broken jaw couldn't hide the truth anymore. Under questioning, his second-in-command confessed Kane had been selling survey coordinates to land barons, plotting to exploit tribal land for gold under the protection of federal uniforms. When Sergeant Dobbins placed Kane under arrest, the gathered warriors let out a single unified chant, not of war, but of justice. Silas could have walked away right then, but he didn't. Instead, he offered to take the evidence maps, journals, a signed confession to the territorial governor in Austin. A white man carrying proof of corruption against his own would have more weight than any native testimony. The ride took 6 days. When Silas returned, arrest warrants had already gone out. Kane and 5 others would stand trial in a court of law. And for the first time in decades, the treaty lines were redrawn to include Comanche burial lands as protected ground. Hawk Runner healed, and over time, became a leader not of war, but of unity. Each spring, a single eagle feather would appear on Silas's fence post. No message, no ceremony, just the symbol, a silent bond between two men who had stood in the middle of a fire and refused to let it burn the world down around them. As dusk settled over the dry plains, the sky painted in streaks of copper and violet. A lone rider emerged from the ridgeline beyond the cedar break. His horse was lathered in sweat, and the boy barely clung to the saddle, slumped forward with blood soaking through his shirt. Silas Redmond had just finished repairing a broken fence post when he spotted the rider veering toward his ranch house. He reached for his rifle out of instinct, but as the figure drew closer and collapsed from the horse before reaching the porch, Silas rushed forward instead. The rider was no older than 17. His skin was sun-darkened, his hair braided in Comanche style, and his chest bore the jagged tear of a fresh wound. Silas knelt beside him, trying to stop the bleeding. The boy grabbed Silas's wrist with surprising strength and forced out a warning between ragged breaths. Soldiers were after him close behind, but more urgently, the boy said helping him would violate sacred law. His name was Red Hawk, and his father was a tribal chief. According to Comanche tradition, if Silas offered him shelter or healing without permission from his tribe, Red Hawk's own father would be honor-bound to spill Silas's blood. The law was older than memory, rooted in something deeper than revenge. It was sacred, unbreakable. Red Hawk pleaded with Silas to walk away, to let him die alone beneath the mesquite and save himself from what would surely come if he intervened. But Silas Redmond didn't walk away. He lifted the boy's limp body and carried him inside, laying him gently on a cot beside the hearth. His hands worked with practiced focus, pressing linen against the wound, pouring clean water, grinding dried yarrow to slow the bleeding. As he worked, Red Hawk drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling half-coherent phrases about soldiers, gunfire, and a betrayal near the canyon trail. When Silas removed the makeshift bandage, he saw the wound wasn't from a cavalry saber. It was a bullet grazed clean, but close to fatal. Outside, the wind began to shift, dry and heavy with the coming storm. And Silas knew he had stepped into something larger than a wounded boy on his doorstep. By the time the sun disappeared, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats thundered across the open field. Silas stepped out onto the porch with his rifle slung low. Not in threat, but warning. 4 riders appeared, soldiers in blue coats, led by a lieutenant with a square jaw and polished boots. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Carter Wynn and claimed they were chasing a fugitive responsible for the murder of 2 Army scouts. He said the boy had turned violent, stolen supplies and vanished near the cliffs. They asked to search the property. Silas met the lieutenant's gaze without blinking and said plainly, "There was no boy there." Wynn's jaw tensed. One of the soldiers behind him rested a hand near his revolver. Silas didn't flinch. Wynn, sensing no confession would come easy, nodded once and turned his men around. But before they left, he looked Silas in the eye and warned that harboring a fugitive would bring consequences. Silas said nothing. Inside, Red Hawk lay sweating, half awake, whispering fragments of tribal law and death rites. He knew his father, Firehand, would come. The tribe would find him, and when they did, even gratitude would not erase the debt of sacred law. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Silas fed the boy soup and cool water, never asking questions but always listening. He learned that Red Hawk had not killed anyone. He had been trying to stop the soldiers from marking burial land for mining exploration. A fight had broken out. He'd been shot while fleeing to warn his people. Silas felt the weight of this truth settle heavy on his chest. He had seen this pattern before, greed dressed in uniforms and sealed with legal orders. On the 4th day, just after sunrise, riders appeared on the horizon, dozens of them. Comanche warriors in full paint and regalia, their horses moving in perfect silence. At their head rode Firehand, a man with eyes like sharpened flint and a face carved from stone. Silas stood on the porch with both hands empty. Firehand dismounted and walked to within 10 paces. The 2 men locked eyes. No words passed between them at first. Then Firehand spoke, voice low but unwavering. He had come not for vengeance, but for truth. Red Hawk emerged from the cabin behind Silas. Still weak, but standing. He told his father everything. About the soldiers, the betrayal, the map to the sacred grounds, and about Silas who had risked his life to save him, knowing what the cost might be. The warriors murmured among themselves, uneasy. Firehand turned to them, lifted a hand, and silence returned. He stepped forward and looked Silas in the eye once more. Then, to everyone's surprise, he removed the beaded necklace from his own neck and placed it on the porch rail. A symbol of thanks, a pardon, an end to the debt of blood. Silas gave a quiet nod. No words were needed. Red Hawk returned with his people, and Firehand left Silas's land in peace. But as the last horseman crested the hill and vanished into the trees, Silas knew things were far from over. He had crossed into sacred ground not with footsteps, but with compassion, and now he carried the weight of that choice wherever he went. The morning sun had barely broken over the distant ridges when the sound of hooves shattered the stillness of Silas Redmond's ranch. Dust plumed along the trail, and through the early haze, a line of blue coats appeared, cavalry riders approaching with purpose, led by a man who rode straighter than the rest. His polished boots and braided leather reins signaling command. Lieutenant Grayson Locke reined in his horse at the edge of the corral and looked down at Silas, who was feeding his dogs near the barn. There was no courtesy in Locke's voice, only accusation masked with official concern. He said they were tracking a fugitive, a Comanche youth named Red Hawk, who had allegedly ambushed a supply convoy, stolen food and medicine bound for tribal children, and killed 2 soldiers in the process. Locke claimed the boy had been wounded in the skirmish and seen riding hard in this direction. Silas didn't respond right away. He straightened, wiped his hands on a rag, and studied the soldiers. They weren't tired, they weren't worried, they were too clean, too precise. That didn't sit right with him. He asked what proof they had. Locke didn't offer any. Instead, he dismounted and approached with the kind of confidence that didn't come from facts, but from rank. He gestured toward the ranch house and said plainly that he intended to search the property. Silas stood his ground. His voice was calm, firm. This was private land, and no one entered without cause or warrant. Locke's eyes narrowed. He reminded Silas of the lives lost, of duty, of cooperation with federal authority. But there was something off in the lieutenant's words, too rehearsed, like he'd said them before under different circumstances. Behind him, the soldiers fanned out slowly, not in a search pattern but in a show of presence. One of them held the reins of an extra horse, an old trick to suggest they expected to take someone back. Silas kept his rifle slung low but in easy reach. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't about to be steamrolled either. Locke's tone shifted then. Harder now. He accused Silas directly of harboring a fugitive, aiding a killer, and obstructing military justice. He said Red Hawk had taken not only supplies but classified documents from the convoy. Silas knew the story was unraveling. The cavalry didn't escort food with lockboxes. And if a young Comanche boy had killed 2 trained soldiers and escaped with supplies, why were there no wounds among Locke's men? No broken wagons, no real evidence. Still, Silas said nothing about the boy who lay quietly in his root cellar, feverish but alive, bandaged and recovering. He didn't flinch when Locke threatened to bring more men next time, or when he suggested that anyone who interfered with military matters might be treated as complicit. Silas merely told the lieutenant he had cattle to tend and fences to mend, and unless they had papers, the ranch was off limits. Locke stared at him for a long moment, jaw clenched before swinging back into his saddle. He gave a signal and the troop turned, hooves pounding as they rode off, but not far just out of sight. Silas knew they'd set up camp near the ridge, watching, waiting. Inside the house, Silas boiled water for more poultices, listening to the wind shift outside. Red Hawk stirred on the cot, eyes fluttering open briefly before falling back into shallow sleep. The boy had said little since arriving, just enough to reveal that the soldiers weren't who they claimed to be. There was no supply drop, There were surveyors marking land deep within Comanche territory, and Red Hawk had ridden out to warn his people. He'd been shot for his trouble. The story Locke told was nothing but a curtain, a lie stitched together to cover something darker. That night, Silas stood on his porch beneath a rising moon, watching the ridge for movement. He knew trouble wasn't over. Soldiers didn't like being defied, and men like Locke didn't like being doubted. The accusations might have sounded official, but Silas could smell the rot behind them. He didn't know the full story yet, but he knew this much: someone was trying to erase a mistake by painting a boy as a criminal. And if they couldn't find Red Hawk, they'd make Silas the villain instead. He lit a lantern, not for light, but as a signal. If the Comanche were near, they'd see it. And if they came, Silas would tell them the truth. All of it, because lies didn't deserve shelter. But the truth, no matter how dangerous, deserved a chance to breathe. The soldiers had ridden off with stiff backs and tight jaws, but Silas Redmond knew they weren't gone for good. He leaned against the porch post, staring at the horizon long after the dust settled. Something in Lieutenant Locke's story didn't sit right. It wasn't just the way the man spoke, too polished, too certain, like he'd rehearsed it. It was the details that gnawed at Silas: the talk of stolen supplies, the supposed attack, the neatness of the timeline. And then there was that pouch. It hung from the saddle of one of the troopers, braided leather with bone toggles, marked with symbols Silas recognized but didn't expect. That design wasn't from White Bull's band. Silas had lived long enough near Comanche lands to know the difference. Each band carried its own markings, its own colors, woven in patterns passed down like scripture. The pouch they carried had belonged to a different people altogether. He stepped down from the porch and walked to the barn. Inside, the shadows were deep, the scent of hay and saddle oil heavy in the air. He opened a wooden crate near the back, pulling out an old blanket, a keepsake from his days trading with the Comanche before things had turned sour between them and the settlers. He unrolled it carefully and compared the designs to what he had seen earlier. His gut clenched. The colors matched, the weavings nearly identical. That pouch wasn't just Comanche, it was from the Greyhawk band, who hadn't been seen near this territory in over a year. They were pushed west, across the dry canyons, after a brutal skirmish no one wanted to talk about. What would one of their pouches be doing in a soldier's possession during an investigation of a crime allegedly committed by a youth from White Bull's tribe that night? Silas couldn't sleep. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the cattle shifted uneasily in their pens. He paced his porch, a lantern swinging from his hand, thoughts heavy as stones. The boy, Red Hawk, had barely spoken since the fever set in. But when Silas knelt beside him with water and cloth, the boy's lips moved with faint words. He spoke of a surveyor, a white man who came to mark the land, who spoke of gold beneath sacred soil. Red Hawk had tried to intervene to warn his father. The soldiers didn't like that. They accused him of interfering, of inciting rebellion. Then they opened fire. The more Silas pieced together, the more the picture sharpened into something ugly. The supplies weren't stolen. They likely never existed. The dead soldiers, possibly casualties of a deeper conflict. Maybe they'd been silenced because they saw too much. Maybe one of them had questioned orders. The pouch could have been taken from someone the soldiers ambushed, or planted as false evidence to build a story around. Either way, Locke's version didn't hold water. And now Silas found himself on dangerous ground. If he said nothing, the boy would be hunted down and killed for something he didn't do. If he spoke, he'd be accusing the army of conspiracy and murder. Near midnight, Silas saddled his horse and rode out to the bluffs east of his ranch. From there, he could see the faint flicker of the soldiers' campfire beyond the low hills. He didn't approach, just watched. He spotted movement near the fire. Men speaking in low tones, one of them unrolling maps, another clutching what looked like a survey ledger. They weren't hunting a fugitive. They were guarding something. On his way back, Silas stopped at the river crossing where Red Hawk had first appeared. The grass was flattened, streaked with blood, But there were no wagon tracks, no broken crates, no sign of a supply convoy ever passing through. He dismounted and knelt, letting his fingers trace the dirt. What he found were boot prints, several pairs all headed west. No wheels, just soldiers on foot. And scattered nearby, half buried in the mud, was a strip of canvas stamped with a government seal, not from a food crate, but from a geological survey kit. When he returned home, the boy was awake, eyes glassy but alert. Silas asked him one question: was it gold? Red Hawk nodded once, weakly. That was all Silas needed to know. The soldiers hadn't come looking for justice. They came to bury a witness. The whole story, the theft, the murders, the pursuit, was nothing more than a cover. Silas sat beside the cot, staring into the hearth as the fire cracked and popped. He knew what would come next. The cavalry would return. And this time, they'd bring more men, more questions, and fewer restraints. And if he stood in their way, he'd be buried along with the truth. But Silas Redmond had never been a man to back down from a lie. Not when lives were on the line. Not when the land itself cried out for someone to listen. The sun hadn't yet burned off the morning mist when they came back. Lieutenant Grayson Locke led his men through the wooden gate with boots heavy and faces set. This time, there were more of them, at least 20 riders, their rifles polished and their horses tense beneath them. Silas Redmond stood on his porch, arms folded, watching with a calm that masked the churn in his gut. He didn't need a telegram to know what this was. It wasn't a search, it was a show, the kind that came before something worse. Locke didn't ask for permission. He simply dismounted, gave a sharp nod to his men, and ordered them to spread out. They fanned across the yard like hounds turned loose, rifles slung but hands close to triggers. A sergeant with a trimmed mustache led 2 men toward the barn. Another pair headed for the water trough. Silas stayed where he was, neither resisting nor cooperating. He had nothing to hide, but he also had nothing to say to men who'd already decided what they were going to find. Red Hawk was no longer in the root cellar. Silas had moved him under cover of darkness to a cave near the ridge, one used by cattlemen in storm season. The boy had regained enough strength to stand, and he understood the danger. He hadn't protested, only nodded with quiet gratitude before disappearing into the night. Now, as soldiers combed through haylofts and storage sheds, Silas watched Lieutenant Locke approach with a swagger too deliberate to be casual. Locke didn't greet him. He simply said they had new information, testimony from a scout who saw someone fleeing this direction after the attack. Silas said nothing. Locke smiled thinly, then signaled toward the barn. A trooper emerged, holding up a bundle of cloth streaked with dried blood. It was tucked beneath a wagon wheel, almost too perfectly placed. The soldier called it out like a prize. Locke turned to Silas, voice rising just enough to be heard by the others. He declared that the evidence was clear. Silas had hidden a fugitive. He'd aided in the escape of a known killer. Under military law, that was enough for arrest. Silas looked at the cloth, then at Locke. The pattern on the shirt was wrong. Too small for Red Hawk. The blood too dry. The cut too neat. It had been planted. Silas knew it. And so did Locke. That was the worst part. The man didn't even try to make it believable. He didn't need truth. He needed a reason. The soldiers gathered in tighter formation. One stepped forward with iron cuffs. Silas raised a hand slowly, not toward his rifle, but toward the porch rail. He rested his fingers there and stared Locke in the eye. Then he asked, plain and calm, where the supply convoy had gone. Locke blinked. Silas asked again if they'd been chasing a boy who stole from a convoy. Where were the wagons? Where were the wounded men? Where was the trail? Locke's jaw tightened. He said the details were classified. Silas raised an eyebrow. He asked if that included the surveyor's tools they'd been hiding near their campfire. That got a reaction, a flicker in Locke's eyes, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. The story was unraveling. The soldiers around them shifted uncomfortably. One of them glanced toward the sergeant, another toward the hill. Silas saw it, then doubt. Not enough to stop what was coming, but enough to plant a seed. Locke recovered quickly, barked orders to restrain Silas, and declared the property under military investigation. But before the cuffs touched his wrists, a deep, rhythmic sound rolled across the land. Drums, war drums. From the ridgeline came the distant thunder of hooves. Every head turned as riders emerged through the trees. Dozens of Comanche warriors, their horses in tight formation, faces painted and weapons ready. At their center rode Firehand, upright and steady, with Red Hawk beside him, alive and strong despite the wound. The boy raised his hand, palm open, a signal of peace. Firehand stopped his mount a dozen paces from the porch. Silence fell. The only sound was the creak of leather and the distant wind. Then Red Hawk spoke. He told the truth not just of the shooting, but of the land survey, the gold beneath the burial sites, and the soldiers' mission to erase what they couldn't control. He told it calmly, his voice unwavering. Every man in that yard heard it. Some looked away, others stood frozen. Locke tried to shout him down, but the words rang hollow. Firehand dismounted and walked toward Silas. In front of everyone, he offered a beaded talisman proof of innocence and of debt repaid. Locke ordered his men to seize them both, but no one moved. The sergeant, once ready with cuffs, took a slow step back, then another. Within moments, the soldiers began to retreat, not in panic, but in silent realization. The trap they'd set had snapped shut, but not on the man they expected. It had caught their own lies in its teeth. Silas stood still as the sun crept higher, knowing the truth had finally found its voice, and it was louder than any uniform. The afternoon heat hung low over the plains, heavy and still. But the silence was deceptive. Silas Redmond could feel the shift in the air before he heard anything, a weight in his chest, a pull in his gut, like the land itself had stopped breathing. He stood alone near the corral, one hand resting on the rail, the other gripping a water bucket he hadn't yet used. Then came the first distant thump, faint as a heartbeat, a drumbeat, deep, measured, ancient. He turned slowly toward the sound. Another beat followed, then another, each one closer, steadier, as if time itself had taken on the rhythm of war. He stepped toward the porch, eyes scanning the horizon. The land stretched wide and empty, but the sound was undeniable now. It came from more than one direction, echoing from the hills, the tree lines, the dry creek beds. He recognized the cadence, not from books or rumors, but from memory. It was the language of warning, the signal of gathering forces, drums of the Comanche. Not just one band, multiple. No tribe beat drums like that unless the cause demanded unity. That meant something terrible or something sacred. Either way, it was coming for him, inside the house. The lantern flickered though the windows were open to the light. Red Hawk stirred on the cot, eyes fluttering beneath his brow, sweat soaking the linen beneath him. The boy was still healing. But he too heard it. He opened his eyes and said nothing. Only listened. Silas brought him water, pressing the cup to his lips. Red Hawk drank slowly, then rasped a single name, Stormrunner. Silas froze. That name hadn't passed anyone's lips in years. It was spoken with reverence and fear. Red Hawk's father, a war chief known across the plains for his fierceness and discipline. If Stormrunner was riding, then the drums were no longer just a warning. They were a verdict being delivered. By dusk, they came into view. First, a line of riders along the eastern ridge, their horses dark against the fading sky. Then a second group from the north, shadows moving through the cedars. Silas counted more than 40 in that group alone. Their war paint glimmered in streaks of red and black, their spears and rifles held high but not yet aimed. Another group crested the hill near the water tower, riding single file, flanking his land like wolves circling prey. They didn't shout. They didn't charge. They surrounded. He didn't reach for his rifle, and not yet. Instead, he lit the lantern on his porch, placing it high on a beam for all to see. It wasn't a challenge. It was a signal of peace, of readiness, of presence. A white man who didn't run, who didn't lie, who would meet them in the open. From the northern edge, a lone rider broke from formation. He wore a long deerskin coat, embroidered with beads and eagle feathers, his face marked by the scars of survival, not age. He rode with perfect posture, as if the horse beneath him was not a mount but an extension of his body. As he approached, the riders behind him stayed still. Only he advanced. Silas recognized him instantly. Storm Runner, war chief of the Twin Mesa Comanche, father of Red Hawk. He stopped 20 feet from the porch and dismounted without ceremony. The silence deepened. Even the horses seemed to still their breath. Storm Runner looked at Silas not with fury, but with judgment. His eyes scanned the property, the barn, the roofline, and finally landed on the door behind which his son was healing. He did not speak. Silas stepped forward, not close, but enough to be heard. He told him the boy was alive, hurt, but alive. He said the truth had been twisted by men in uniforms, and that he had no interest in war or sides, only justice. Storm Runner listened, arms crossed, head tilted slightly, as if weighing not just the word, but the man saying them. Behind him, the warriors held their formation. No one moved. The drums had stopped now. The silence was heavier than the thunder before it. Then, the door creaked open, and Red Hawk appeared. He leaned on the frame, pale and weary, but standing. His voice, when it came, was hoarse but clear. He spoke in his father's tongue, then again in English, for all to hear. He told them what had happened. The soldiers, the false accusations, the hidden markers on sacred land. He told them Silas had saved his life, knowing the danger, expecting nothing in return. Storm Runner walked to his son, placed a steady hand on his shoulder, and looked back at Silas. There was no nod, no smile, just the faintest lowering of the chin, a gesture not of surrender, but of recognition. A man had done right, against odds, against fear. The encirclement held a few moments longer. Then one by one, the warriors began to turn. No words, no cheers, just silence as they faded back into the dusk. Silas stood alone once more, but not in fear. He'd been surrounded by judgment and had not been found lacking. The twilight air was thick with silence, the kind that settles just before something shatters. Silas Redmond stood on his porch, his arms crossed, watching the circle of soldiers and warriors hold their uneasy formation. No one spoke, no rifles raised, but the weight of what was unspoken pressed on every man's chest. Storm Runner, tall and motionless in front of his horse, had listened to his son's testimony without a flicker of emotion. Red Hawk had said his piece, told them all how the soldiers had not been on a relief mission, but had been escorting a government agent deep into Comanche land. His voice was weak but unwavering. He didn't embellish, he didn't beg, he simply told the truth. And now, everyone waited for the man in blue to respond. Lieutenant Grayson Locke stood surrounded, no longer the confident figure who'd barked orders just hours earlier. His hand hovered near his belt, not on his weapon, but on a leather pouch. His eyes darted to his men, some of whom had begun to shift uneasily in their saddles. The story he'd woven so carefully was unraveling. Silas saw it in the way the young troopers avoided his gaze, in the way the sergeant beside him clenched his jaw and glanced toward the canyon trail. They weren't there for justice. They never had been. Storm Runner finally spoke. His voice was calm, deep, but edged like a blade. He asked Locke to deny his son's words, to explain why a supposed supply run was led by armed cavalry and trailed no wagons. He asked where the food was, where the medicine was, where the dead soldiers were buried. Locke said nothing. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the cooling wind. When pressed again, this time by Silas, he stammered something about classified orders and threats to national interest. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. The sergeant stepped forward, his voice low but steady. He said he'd ridden with Locke since Fort Jasper and had followed orders to the letter. But he hadn't seen any supply manifests. He hadn't seen a single crate of grain or medicine. What he had seen was a man with surveyor tools escorted under cover of night into territory clearly marked on army maps as tribal land. He said Locke told them the mission was to secure mineral rights before the treaties changed. He hadn't questioned it at the time. Now he wasn't so sure. Locke turned on him, hissed a warning, but it was too late. The others had heard it. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Even the Comanche warriors leaned in, catching the shift. Red Hawk coughed, blood flecking his lips, but he stood straighter. He pointed at the leather pouch Locke clutched. It held the surveyor's markings, the same kind he had seen back at the sacred grounds before he was shot. Silas stepped forward, reached for the pouch. Locke tried to pull away, but two soldiers blocked him, not with violence, but with the quiet force of men who had seen enough. Inside the pouch were survey notes, coordinates, markings of topography. The documents weren't written in military terms, but in the language of land division acreage. Mineral rights, underground water channels. They had nothing to do with humanitarian relief. They were about gold, about land theft, about greed wrapped in a uniform. Silas read the words aloud, his voice cutting through the silence like thunder. Stormrunner's eyes never left Locke's face. He asked one final question: had Locke given the order to shoot his son? The lieutenant opened his mouth, closed it, then looked to the ground. For a moment, he was just a man, small, cornered, stripped of his symbols. He nodded, not with pride, not even with shame, just surrender. He had done what he thought no one would uncover. But now, under the weight of truth and the eyes of men no longer willing to be fooled, he had nothing left to hide behind. The silence that followed wasn't one of peace. It was the silence of reckoning. The sergeant ordered Locke disarmed and placed under arrest for conspiracy and falsification of military orders. Some of the younger soldiers exchanged glances of disbelief, unsure of what would come next. Stormrunner gave no command. He didn't need to. The truth had been spoken not by force, but by exposure. Red Hawk had defended land meant to remain untouched, a place of spirits and stories older than the fort that sent men like Locke to measure its soil. As the sun slipped below the hills, Silas watched the Comanche begin to withdraw. No words of thanks, no ceremony, just the quiet nod of a father to a man who had stood beside his son when others sought to bury him. Red Hawk leaned on his father as they walked toward the horses. He looked back once, and in his eyes was no triumph, only relief, the kind that comes when truth, long buried, is finally allowed to breathe. The sky was fading into the deep blue of approaching night when the front door creaked open and all eyes turned. From the shadowed interior of the cabin, Red Hawk emerged. He was pale, unsteady, a blanket draped over his shoulders and blood still dried along his side. But he walked with the kind of strength that comes from knowing the truth is finally ready to be spoken. The warriors lining the hillside sat still on their horses, and the soldiers stood rigid in the yard. No one moved, no one breathed. The boy who had been called a fugitive, a thief, a killer now stood before both sides, not with weapons, but with words. Silas Redmond stepped beside him, ready to catch him if he collapsed. But Red Hawk lifted a hand. He didn't want help. Not yet. He looked first to the Comanche, to his father Stormrunner and the warriors who had ridden for miles to avenge what they believed was an injustice. Then he turned to the soldiers, their rifles still slung across their backs, their faces marked with doubt and shame. And finally he spoke. His voice was hoarse but clear, rising and falling like the wind that danced through the open plains. He told them there was no supply convoy, that the mission had nothing to do with feeding children or protecting peace. He explained that a government surveyor had come to their burial lands, escorted by soldiers under the cover of night. They had brought stakes, tools, ledgers measuring ground that no man had a right to disturb. When Red Hawk confronted them, unarmed, asking them to leave the sacred site, they responded with gunfire. He barely escaped with his life. He'd run, bleeding, riding hard across miles of rough country until he reached Silas's ranch. He paused, breathing shallowly, then continued. Silas had taken him in. He hadn't asked questions. He'd seen the wound, seen the pain, and acted not from obligation or fear, but decency. Red Hawk told them all that Silas had saved his life, even knowing what it could cost. That the story Lieutenant Locke had told was a lie, a cover for greed and trespass. He held up the leather pouch now clutched in his hand. Inside were the surveyor's notes, the government seal, coordinates and mineral evaluations, proof of what had really brought the soldiers into tribal lands. The effect was immediate. The soldiers shifted. Some lowered their eyes. A few exchanged hushed words, disbelief giving way to realization. Among the Comanche, murmurs broke out. Stormrunner said nothing, but his hand flexed on the reins and his expression darkened with every word. He had prepared for war, but war, now, meant acting on a lie. Silas stepped forward then, his voice firm and steady. He didn't speak for Red Hawk, or for the tribe, or for the army. He spoke for the land between them. He reminded them all that vengeance was easy, that blood called for blood, and if they gave in to that instinct now, it would set fire to everything they still had left. But justice, true justice, was harder. It required restraint. It demanded truth over pride. He looked to Stormrunner and asked that the matter be settled by their law, not by violence. That they take the evidence, take the truth, and carry it to the place where it could not be buried or denied. To the courts, to the people. Let the liars be judged, not the innocent caught in their path. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Stormrunner dismounted. He walked slowly to his son, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, and nodded, not with warmth, but with resolve. He turned to Silas and offered a short bow, not of thanks, but of understanding. The soldiers didn't resist, not this time. They stood in quiet rows as Locke was bound and taken under custody. The surveyor's documents rolled tight in the satchel that would now ride east toward Austin. As night fell, the Comanche turned their horses and rode back into the dark, the beat of hooves echoing like a retreat from the edge of a cliff. The soldiers packed in silence, their campfire smoldering low. Red Hawk remained beside the porch, wrapped now in a fresh blanket, his face lined with exhaustion. Silas stood next to him, not as savior, not as protector, but as a man who had chosen truth when it mattered most. They watched the plains return to stillness. That night, no drums sounded, no rifles fired. The stars came out, and for the first time in days, the land was quiet, not from fear, but from peace won by the strength of a voice and the courage to speak it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dry ground as the two groups faced each other, neither side making a move. Silas Redmond stood with his hands clenched by his sides, watching the tension tighten like a noose around every man present. Stormrunner, still as stone, stepped forward with his son, Red Hawk, beside him. The boy looked worn but defiant, his eyes never leaving the line of soldiers opposite them. Then, in a voice as cold as the wind coming off the hills, Stormrunner spoke. He invoked the ancient right of their people trial by combat, not for vengeance, but for truth. He called out the name of the man who had given the order to fire on Red Hawk and trespass sacred ground, Lieutenant Grayson Locke, the man who had wrapped greed in government and tried to bury his crime beneath a soldier's badge. Locke flinched, but quickly regained his composure. He sneered, claiming no such laws held weight here. But Stormrunner raised a hand, and the warriors behind him all lifted their weapons skyward, not in attack, but in silent unity. Silas stepped forward too, stating clearly that the land they stood on was not only ranchland, but a place where the truth had already spilled blood. If Locke would not answer to tribal law, then let him answer to the eyes of every man watching. The silence broke when Sergeant Adam Morrison, Locke's own second-in-command, walked forward. He had watched it all, the lies, the manipulation, the twisting of orders, and now, with evidence laid bare and the weight of the truth crushing down, he made no move to stop the challenge. Instead, he crossed his arms and waited. That was all the answer Stormrunner needed. A circle was drawn. Dust kicked up by boots formed a ghostly haze around its edges. From among the warriors, a tall fighter stepped forward, broad-shouldered, scarred from years of battle. His face bore the markings of Wind Creek clan. He said nothing, only nodded once to his chief and stepped into the circle. Locke was handed a combat blade standard military issue. The warrior held only a traditional bone-handled knife. No armor, no tricks, just skill. The fight began in silence. No drumbeat, no signal. Just the sudden rush of motion. Locke lunged first, wild and desperate, the kind of strikes taught in drills but stripped of discipline by fear. The warrior sidestepped with ease, letting Locke's own momentum drag him forward. The crowd watched. No cheers, no sound but the shuffle of boots in the dirt. Steel met steel, sparks flying as blades clashed. But it was clear to all who watched Locke fought like a man trying to escape a truth that finally had him cornered. The Comanche fought like a man defending the bones of his ancestors. Minutes passed like hours. Blood beaded on both men's skin, minor cuts at first, then deeper wounds. Locke grunted, his coat torn at the shoulder, breath coming harder now. Then he made a critical mistake, overextending with a wide slash meant to intimidate. The warrior ducked, spun, and struck Locke's thigh with a downward blow. The lieutenant collapsed to one knee, his blade slipping from his hand. He tried to scramble back, but the warrior pressed the edge of his knife against his chest, not deep enough to kill, but enough to force stillness. The crowd stood frozen. Locke, panting and wide-eyed, stared up at the man who now held his fate in his hands. The warrior looked to Stormrunner, who gave a single nod. Then he stepped back, allowing Locke to live but making clear he had lost not just the fight, but the respect of all who bore witness. Sergeant Morrison stepped into the circle then, boots kicking up dust, and without hesitation placed the lieutenant in cuffs. He read the charges aloud: conspiracy, abuse of authority, falsifying reports, and endangering both military and civilian lives. Locke didn't resist. Whatever fire had fueled his arrogance was gone, bled out in the dust of the circle. The Comanche warriors gave no cheer, no chant of victory. They simply turned and began to ride, slow and quiet, their message already delivered in the language of action. Red Hawk stood with Silas, watching them disappear into the distant trees. The boy said nothing. He didn't need to. What had nearly become war had ended with a blade lowered instead of raised, with law upheld not by courts but by tradition older than the nation itself. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, Silas sat on the porch, cleaning a knife he hadn't needed to draw. Red Hawk leaned nearby, eyes fixed on the horizon. They both knew peace wouldn't last forever. Not out here where boundaries were still drawn in dust and blood. But for now, justice had spoken, and for once, someone had listened. The wind swept over the open plain with a low hum, stirring dust, and the last whispers of twilight, as the soldiers gathered their scattered gear and the Comanche warriors lingered near the ridge. Silas Redmond stepped out of his barn carrying the leather pouch that had started it all. Its surface was worn, the seams toughened with age, but inside it carried something that could unravel everything the soldiers had claimed, without ceremony. He walked to the center of the clearing where the two groups faced each other, and held it up for all to see. Sergeant Adam Morrison stood among the remaining troops, his face tight with suspicion. He gave a curt nod, signaling Silas to proceed. The warriors, led by Stormrunner, remained on horseback, silent but watchful. Red Hawk sat beside his father, pale and still recovering, but his eyes sharp with recognition. He had seen that pouch before back in the hills where the shooting began. It hadn't been carried by a Comanche. It had been strapped to the saddle of a man in uniform. Silas untied the flap and pulled out the contents slowly, deliberately. First came the map's parchments, creased and smudged with dirt, covered in red-inked lines and notations. Then came small wooden stakes with numbered tags. Finally, he held up a sealed ledger bound in canvas, marked not with military insignia, but with the emblem of a private land survey company operating out of Dallas. The pieces clicked into place faster than anyone could deny them. He read from the ledger: coordinates, mineral assessments, notations on soil composition and water access. Every page a record of land marked for acquisition land that fell deep within Comanche burial territory. The deception had been dressed in uniform, but its roots were corporate. Greed had worn the face of duty. Stormrunner dismounted and approached. His boots moved in slow, deliberate steps across the dust. He didn't touch the documents, he didn't need to. The markings spoke for themselves. He turned toward the soldiers, his voice calm but lined with anger that ran deep. He asked them plainly how many of them knew this wasn't about security, or peacekeeping, or even stolen supplies. How many had followed orders they never questioned. No one answered. Sergeant Morrison stepped forward. He took the ledger from Silas's hand and flipped through the pages with furrowed brows. His expression shifted anger, disbelief, then something colder. He called out Lieutenant Locke by name. But Locke was already bound, his face sunken in defeat, still. Morrison asked him if he had acted alone. Locke hesitated, then shook his head. He named two more, a major at the district post and a civilian consultant who had coordinated the mission under false pretenses. They had used military escorts not for protection but for intimidation. They had disguised a land grab as a humanitarian route. The implications rippled through the yard like a wildfire. What was supposed to be a routine military operation had turned out to be the first stone in a far deeper well of corruption. Morrison ordered one of his men to ride to the nearest telegraph station and contact the federal marshal. He declared that those named would be arrested and charged with conspiracy, fraud, and desecration of protected lands. He did it with the tone of a man who had seen too many lies and was tired of being used as their shield. The Comanche warriors listened without cheering. They had come ready for war, but found instead a hollow scheme carved out behind closed doors and sealed envelopes. Stormrunner nodded once to Silas, then looked back at his son. Red Hawk's eyes were wet not with grief, but with the weight of knowing the truth would no longer be buried beneath boots and papers. Morrison turned to Stormrunner and addressed him with respect, something rare between their peoples. He said justice would be pursued through courts, but that he understood if trust would take longer to earn back. Stormrunner didn't speak, only offered a slow, grave nod. As night fell, the camp slowly disbanded. Soldiers moved in tired silence, the air no longer tense with fear but heavy with the echo of revelations. The warriors rode out without fanfare, their silhouettes swallowed by the horizon. Silas stood alone near his porch, the ledger and maps still in his hands. Behind him, Red Hawk rested inside, no longer a fugitive, no longer hunted but not yet safe. Trust takes time to rebuild. So does the land, once it's been carved and measured for another man's profit. That night, Silas lit the lantern above his door and kept it burning until dawn, a quiet promise that truth still had a place to be seen. The morning after the circle of warriors disappeared into the misty hills, Silas Redmond sat on his porch with a ledger on his lap and a sealed leather pouch beside him. The ranch was quiet, but his thoughts churned like a storm. The evidence maps, survey records, forged military orders was enough to shake the foundation of every lie that had passed through these plains under the name of progress. But exposing it wasn't going to be simple. It would take more than whispers. It would take a man standing before the powerful and daring to speak the truth. Inside the cabin, Red Hawk rested near the hearth, his breathing steady now. The fever broken, Stormrunner had left him in Silas's care, not as an act of trust, but as a challenge to protect the boy and carry the truth where it could finally matter. Silas wasn't one for politics. He hadn't set foot in a city for years, but he knew this wasn't just about one boy or one ranch anymore. What had happened here was part of something far larger, something that ran all the way to Austin and likely beyond. It needed light, and he had to be the one to bring it, the one to. That afternoon, Silas saddled his best horse, tucked the pouch into a weatherproof saddlebag, and handed a folded letter to Red Hawk. It was for Stormrunner, a simple note that said the truth would not be buried. Red Hawk said nothing, only nodded. The gesture meant more than words. Then Silas rode out alone, heading east, toward the capital where men in fine suits and polished boots sat behind desks. thinking they knew the West by name alone. The journey took days. Storms threatened, trails washed out, and more than once he had to sleep under a tarp while coyotes circled nearby. But he didn't turn back. The weight in his saddlebag was heavier than any rain. When he arrived in Austin, coated in dust and saddle-worn, he walked straight into the governor's office without waiting for permission. He laid the documents on the desk and asked to speak under oath. The aides hesitated, but something in his voice, raw, steady, unwavering, cut through bureaucracy like a blade. He wasn't just another rancher with a grievance. He was the only living witness to a conspiracy rooted in blood and gold. Over the next 2 days, Silas gave his full account to officials, lawyers, and finally the territorial governor himself. He told them what he had seen: the fake supply mission, the forged reports, the illegal surveys across sacred burial grounds, and the ambush that nearly cost a boy his life. He showed them the ledger, the maps, the seal of the private land company embedded in military orders. He told them about Red Hawk, about the war drums that echoed through the hills, and about the blade lowered instead of raised. When he finished, the room was silent. The investigation launched within a week. Agents were dispatched to Fort Jasper. Arrests followed within days. Lieutenant Locke, the private contractor who coordinated the mission, and a major in logistics who had signed off on the false paperwork. More names surfaced as records were examined, including officers who had accepted bribes, clerks who had doctored manifests, and businessmen who had tried to carve up sacred land from behind closed doors. What had been a quiet scheme grew into the largest corruption investigation Texas had seen in a decade. The governor, under pressure from both the federal government and mounting public outrage, signed a new treaty with the Comanche leadership. The burial lands would be permanently protected. Surveying them without tribal approval would be punishable by law. More than that, the agreement recognized the right of native nations to challenge encroachments through legal channels. Not just force. It was the beginning of something new, not peace. Not entirely, but a different kind of ground to stand on. Back at the ranch, weeks later, Silas returned to find Red Hawk on his feet, still thin but stronger. Word had already spread. Some settlers were wary of him now, afraid of what he had stirred. Others came by to shake his hand. A few brought food. They said it was about time someone stood up and did what was right. Silas didn't think of himself as a hero. He'd only told the truth, but in a place where so many had learned to look away. Maybe that was enough. That evening, he and Red Hawk sat by the fire. The land around them was quiet, the stars just starting to pierce the dusk. Red Hawk asked if the men in Austin had really listened. Silas nodded, then said something he hadn't believed until now. Sometimes words are louder than war drums if you speak them at the right time, and loud enough for the world to hear. The seasons shifted quietly on the plains as they always had, with the wind carrying both dust and memory. The battles were over, but the echoes remained etched in the land, whispered by the trees, and woven into the stories told around every fire. Red Hawk, once a boy fleeing with blood on his side and fear in his chest, now stood tall among his people. His wound had healed, leaving a faint scar across his ribs, but more importantly, it had left a mark on his spirit, a fire that did not burn with vengeance but with vision. Under the guidance of Stormrunner and the elders, he trained not only in the ways of the warrior but in the counsel of peace. He learned to speak not just with strength, but with clarity. And as the moons passed, he became a leader of his people. Young in years but seasoned by truth. Far to the west, Silas Redmond's ranch remained where it always had, nestled between two ridgelines, with a porch that faced the morning sun. It looked no different than it had the day he first took in the wounded boy. But those who visited knew it was more than just a patch of land. It had become something sacred not by blood, but by choice. It was a place where neither tribe nor uniform held dominance, where no man raised a rifle without first raising his voice. Silas never called it a sanctuary. But that's what it became. Warriors passed through on quiet horses. Soldiers stopped with respectful silence. Treaties were discussed here, not signed, but understood. It became the in-between, the thin line where trust was tested and slowly over the years, earned. Every spring without fail, Silas would rise before dawn and find it waiting, an eagle feather resting gently on his doorstep, bound with a strip of red cloth. No rider ever approached, no sound ever gave away who had left it. But he always knew. It was Red Hawk's way of speaking without words, of honoring a promise that had never needed to be spoken aloud. One feather, every year, a symbol of a bond that had been forged in fire and tempered in restraint. Silas never picked them up right away. He would sit beside them, coffee in hand, watching the horizon as the sun crept up and kissed the edge of the hills. Only when the day was fully born would he lift the feather and place it on the mantle inside a quiet collection of time, of memory, of meaning. Red Hawk grew into his name. He led not with anger but with wisdom. He negotiated peace among rival tribes, opened schools for children to learn both their heritage and the world beyond it. He returned often to the ridge above Silas's ranch, never announcing himself, but always leaving something behind, an herb bundle, a carved token, or simply a set of footprints by the creek. Silas never asked for more. The silence between them had long since become its own kind of language. In Austin, the echoes of the old corruption trials still stirred now and then, as new politicians tried to forget what had been exposed. But they never fully could. Too many people still remembered. Too many records remained in dusty cabinets with Redmond's name at the bottom of every page. Silas himself never returned to the capital. He preferred the company of the land, the slow rhythm of hooves and fence posts, the occasional visitor who came not for answers, but for perspective. He grew older, the way men do when they've seen too much to ever be surprised again. His hands stiffened, his back bent a little more each year. But his eyes stayed sharp. Children came by sometimes to help mend fences or fill water troughs. Wide-eyed and curious about the stories they'd heard. He'd tell them some just enough to paint a picture, but always ended with a quiet reminder: courage isn't just what you show in battle. It's what you choose when no one's watching. Years passed, then decades. Stormrunner eventually walked his final trail, and Red Hawk lit the ceremonial fire as chief. Treaties were signed and mostly honored. The land still saw hardship, droughts, disputes, the slow creep of towns, but it also saw healing. The ridge where the warriors once circled grew thick with wildflowers each spring, and the ranch, though aged and weathered, never once stood empty. On the morning of Silas Redmond's last ride around his property, he paused at the edge of the west pasture and looked to the sky. A single eagle circled high above, its wings spread wide against the pale blue. He tipped his hat, the gesture small but filled with everything that words couldn't hold. When he passed, the ranch didn't close. It lived on, tended by those who understood its history and honored its spirit. And still, each spring, a feather appears. No one sees it arrive. No one claims to know who leaves it. But it always finds its place on the porch, a silent promise that peace, once chosen, never truly fades. It endures, as all legacies worth keeping do. This story reminds us that doing the right thing often requires quiet courage, not grand gestures, but steady choices made when no one is watching. Silas Redmond didn't seek recognition or reward. He simply stood for truth, acted with decency, and honored the humanity in others. His ranch became a place of peace, not because of power, but because of trust earned over time, tested by hardship and reaffirmed through quiet acts of respect. For older adults, this message holds special meaning. We've lived long enough to know that life is not just about surviving conflict, but about healing after it. The story encourages us to be bridges in a divided world, to listen when it's easier to judge, and to stand firm when it would be easier to walk away. Like Silas, We may never see the full impact of our choices, but sometimes a small act of kindness, a word of truth, or a promise kept can ripple far beyond what we imagine. And in the end, it's not the noise we make that defines us, but the legacy we leave behind.